Hey, Prime members, you can binge all 10 episodes of Cold, ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the app today. This season of the Cold podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please, take care in listening. The TV network ABC premiered a new crime drama in February of 1989.
Tonight, Burt Reynolds stars as B.L. Stryker.
I'd never heard of B.L. Stryker until I came across a reference to it in the Sheree Warren case files. So I did what any curious journalist would do. I ordered a DVD set off eBay. It's Friday night, and I've got a cold beverage in one hand, got a bag of chips in the other. Let's put this DVD on. The title character, B.L. Stryker, is a former New Orleans police detective. He retires to his hometown of Palm Beach, Florida, then against his better judgment, finds himself pressed into service as a private investigator.
Whatever problems Palm Beach has, Palm Beach can work them out.
The plot of the first episode revolves around a serial rapist who sneaks into the homes of young socialites. The police turn to Stryker for help.
This is the fourth girl who's been attacked in the last 6 weeks.
I'm a little surprised, having now seen it, that this episode aired on primetime TV. There are a couple of scenes that show the assaults. They're framed to avoid anything explicit, but something just feels off to me about watching a dramatization of a sexual assault as a form of family entertainment. Not everyone shares my sensitivity. Case in point, a few days after this show aired, an FBI agent in Salt Lake City received a phone call from an inmate at the Iron County Correctional Facility in southern Utah. He told the agent he was locked up with a guy named Cary Hartmann, who was serving time for rape. He said Cary had watched B.L. Stryker, specifically the scenes depicting the sexual assaults, and, quote, after viewing the show, Hartmann acted in a different manner. That comes from a report the FBI agent wrote. It's never before been made public. He didn't go into detail about what different meant, but I can just imagine how someone like Cary Hartmann would have reacted to seeing a depiction of a crime not unlike his own on TV. The agent kept his new snitch's identity secret, assigning him the catchy nickname SU-1815-C. I'll just call him Charlie. Charlie, the informant, and the FBI agent talked several more times in the days that followed. Charlie said he had heard Cary Hartmann talking about the disappearance of Sheree Warren. Former Roy City Police Detective Jack Bell had briefed the FBI on the Sheree Warren case.
Of course, Sheree was on their list of missing people, national list.
And what Charlie described tracked pretty close to the theory Jack Bell had himself come up with during his years working the Sheree Warren case.
I always thought after Cary had become the number one suspect, I quit looking at Chuck, that Sheree had found out something about Cary. Whether it was the fact that he was raping these women, or had other girlfriends, or the supper club, or something that she confronted him about, and he whopped her with something.
Here's what Charlie said he had heard from Cary. Sheree had gone to Cary's apartment on the night of her disappearance. They had argued over Cary's plan to go out drinking. Cary had slipped Sheree a pill to incapacitate her, then later strangled Sheree and buried her body near a boulder and a pine tree. Cary had driven Sheree's car to Las Vegas that night and flown home under a false name. It sounded plausible to the special agent. The FBI had, after all, helped investigate the car's discovery in Vegas a little over 3 years earlier.
They had the FBI process it.
Before police in Las Vegas turned the car over to Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren.
Chuck went down and got it. They released it to him.
Charlie told the FBI Cary had kept a diary with details about all the rapes he had committed prior to his arrest. He said Cary had been tipped off Ogden police were looking at him as a suspect and had trashed the diary to prevent detectives from finding it. This caught my attention when I first read it in the FBI files. I'd been told the detectives who had investigated Cary had gone to great lengths to keep him from realizing he was on their radar. But I heard a different story when I sat down to talk with Cary's old friend, Dave Moore.
In fact, I remember when he first became a suspect, Chris had called my Uncle Don and myself down to his office.
Dave's uncle, Don Moore, was a sergeant in the Ogden Police Department, and by Chris, he means Ogden Police Detective Chris Zimmerman. Dave said Chris.
Explained what was going on. He says, I just want to lay it up front with you.
So it's plausible Cary might have had prior warning of his arrest. I wanted to ask Zimmerman about this, but he declined my request for an interview. The most interesting bit of information Charlie the informant fed the FBI involved Cary Hartmann and Ted Bundy. Charlie said Cary had a strange infatuation with Bundy. He said Cary dog-eared books about the serial killer and insisted on calling him by his proper name, Theodore, instead of Ted. The state of Florida had executed Bundy just a few weeks earlier. Days ahead of the execution, Bundy had granted an interview to a detective from the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office named Dennis Couch.
He was a defeated person. He was extremely fatigued, and he indicated that he was appalled by the senselessness of it all.
Bundy had confessed to several unsolved Utah murders.
But Couch did not get the answer he was hoping for regarding another Utah murder, that of 21-year-old Nancy Baird of Layton. Bundy insisted he had no part of that killing.
Nancy Perry Baird had disappeared from a gas station where she worked, a little south of Ogden, on the evening of July 4th, 1975, just over 10 years before Sheree Warren vanished. Nancy resembled Sheree in many ways. A young mother, divorced but dating, working to get by while leaning on her parents for support. Police investigated Nancy's ex-husband and her boyfriend, but both had alibis. Nancy Baird's case remains unsolved even today. Her body has never been found. I plan to discuss Nancy Baird's disappearance in more detail in a bonus episode at the end of this season. The reason I'm sharing a bit of it with you now is because the FBI files say Charlie the informant, quote, learned Cary Hartmann was an acquaintance of Nancy Baird's, and Charlie said Cary questioned why Theodore was accused of involvement in Nancy Baird's disappearance. He implied Cary Hartmann might have killed both Nancy Baird and Sheree Warren. But could Charlie be trusted? This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 6, Lying Liars. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. Only a small fraction of cold cases receive the attention they deserve. Sometimes that's because the victims fall on the fringes of society. Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom is an original podcast from ID investigating the murder of Renee Bergeron. A passerby found her body in Alabama in November of 1993. She had been mutilated, but her case garnered little sympathy at the time. Now, 30 years later, host Sarah Kalin is reviving the investigation, uncovering new leads and new suspects. It's a compelling story for anyone who cares about cold cases. Listen to Why Can't We Talk About Amanda's Mom on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I love listening to interesting stories, whether that's a podcast or audiobook. I'm currently re-listening to a favorite audiobook of mine. It's called The Last Season, and it's about a backcountry ranger who disappeared in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. It's available on Audible, which makes it easy to listen anytime, anywhere. Audible has a huge selection of audiobooks across all genres, everything from mysteries to memoirs and more. As a member, you choose one title a month to keep from the catalog. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/coldpodcast or text coldpodcast to 500-500. That's audible.com/coldpodcast or text coldpodcast to 500-500 to try Audible free for 30 days. audible.com/coldpodcast. A few minutes ago, I described watching the first episode of an old TV show called BL Stryker. A jailhouse snitch had told the FBI Cary Hartmann had watched it too. The show rankled me a bit when I watched it because of how it ignored the experiences of the fictional victims. The main character, Stryker, made just one mention to a young woman about seeing a therapist after her assault.
You mean a shrink?
Yeah.
The episode didn't delve into the psychological trauma real-life victims face.
We want them to be able to resume their lives and feel comfortable with that. And to do that, they have to gain some control back over their lives after they've been assaulted.
During the 80s, survivors of rape and sexual assault who chose to report in Utah were often paired with a counselor to help them navigate the criminal justice process.
Debbie Hinnick is a victim who says she wanted to testify. She wanted to get the guy who raped her. But she says it would have been nearly impossible without the help of the victim witness counselors.
They really made me feel a lot better. Because even though you know you didn't invite it, you still feel guilty, occasionally saying, did I do something wrong? Did I invite this? Should I have done something differently? But they make you realize that you're just a victim of circumstance. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The man who attacked Debbie, Nathaniel Bell, was convicted of 5 separate sexual assaults on women.
And by coincidence, Nathaniel Bell later ended up in the same sex offender therapy group as Cary Hartmann at the Iron County Correctional Facility. Nathaniel and Cary didn't get along. One day in April of 1989, they were playing a game of handball with 2 other inmates at the jail's gym. Handball involves slapping a small rubber ball, bouncing it off the floor and walls of an enclosed court. It had been one of Cary's favorite pastimes before his arrest and conviction. It's not a contact sport, but this match included more than a little bumping and jostling. At one point, Nathaniel told Cary, quote, "You get in my way again, come hell or high water, I'm running over your ass." Nathaniel then served the ball, and Cary lunged for the return. Cary would later insist he'd only brushed against Bell, accidentally, but Bell would describe Cary punching him in the gut. A cheap shot, especially because just a few years earlier Nathaniel had been stabbed in the same spot. Nathaniel pivoted and whipped his own fist against Cary's jaw. Cary's eyes rolled back in their sockets. He crumpled, his skull striking the solid floor with a thud. Blood began to bubble from his mouth and nose. A separate pool of blood spread from beneath his head. Guards rushed in to find Cary unconscious. They called an ambulance. Cary ended up being okay, though it took stitches to close the nasty split on the back of his scalp. Clearly, Cary wasn't making many friends on the inside. He wanted out, and he had an idea how to make that happen. The jury that had convicted Cary Hartmann in the first of the 4 rape cases prosecutors had filed against him based its decision in part on a science called serology. Serology, the study of bodily fluids, could narrow a field of suspects based on their blood or saliva, but not pinpoint an individual.
We do not give absolutes. We give probabilities. Serology has always been in that area.
But by the end of the 80s, an emerging field of study promised to revolutionize forensic science.
With DNA, our probabilities are a lot higher.
It's difficult to overstate how profound an impact DNA has had on the criminal justice system in the last 30 years. DNA evidence can today link suspects to crime scenes when no other evidence can, or it can exclude them. Some people who have served decades in prison have had their convictions overturned on the strength of DNA evidence. But in 1989, that revolution was still just over the horizon. Cary Hartmann could see it coming. He filed a civil lawsuit at the end of that year against the director of Utah State Crime Lab. He demanded an opportunity to have DNA analysis performed on the evidence gathered from the body of his victim.
DNA fingerprinting can match a suspect to blood, semen, even a hair follicle left behind.
DNA's admissibility as evidence hadn't yet been established in Utah law. Cary wanted to break new ground.
Legal and science experts say it's only a matter of time before DNA evidence is used in Utah by both prosecutors and suspects.
Cary insisted a lab would not find his DNA in the evidence swabs. Former Weber County Attorney Reed Richards told me he felt confident the conviction he'd secured against Cary would withstand any challenge.
I had no problem with any DNA samples. The problem is I doubt that they saved that stuff.
Reed told me it's common practice for police departments and crime labs to discard evidence once trials and appeals are all complete. Cary's case was complete, so Reed didn't think the crime lab would have saved the swabs needed for any DNA analysis.
But maybe they did.
The judge didn't decide Cary's DNA lawsuit right away. So let me tell you about what happened in the meantime. Cary received a package in the mail from a woman named Teresa. I've mentioned her before. Cary had cold-called Teresa a few days before his arrest in the rape investigation, giving her the old lingerie survey. She had remained on the line, then agreed to meet Cary for drinks. Teresa, it turns out, had stayed in touch with Cary after his conviction. The package Teresa sent Cary contained a cassette tape, sealed in plastic. It was the album Riptide by Robert Palmer, which included the radio hit, Addicted to Love. Staff at the Iron County Jail were suspicious. They tore off the shrink wrap, cracked the case, and put the cassette in a tape player. They immediately realized someone had recorded over Riptide. In its place on Side A was a recording of a woman reading sexually explicit stories. Side B contained something more performative. I'll leave it at that. The Utah Department of Corrections prohibited inmates from possessing sexual materials. Getting caught with incoming contraband put Cary in violation of a contract he had signed upon entering sex offender therapy. A therapist told Cary if he wanted to remain in the program, he'd have to consent to taking a plethysmograph.
In Utah, all adult sex offenders take a test that may show if they're likely to reoffend.
Think of it like a polygraph, with some extra hardware.
The tester, in another room, plays a videotape showing pictures of men and women of different ages. A computer is supposed to measure the subject's arousal to what he's seeing on the videotape and hearing on an audio tape.
A sort of sexual lie detector, used to find out what kind of stimuli a test subject responds to most strongly by measuring biometrics, including blood flow to the genitals.
These are hooked to the fingers. And then this is a respiration belt that goes around the chest. The third one is hooked directly to the penis.
Ugh. This plethysmograph device might sound familiar if you've listened to Season 1 of this podcast. A judge once ordered Josh Powell to undergo a plethysmograph examination. Josh instead killed himself and his 2 young sons. Cary Hartmann wanted no part of this. Prison records show he ripped up a plethysmograph consent form. He told his therapist he hadn't raped anyone and wouldn't take the test. As a result, the therapist kicked him out of the program. Completing sex offender therapy would be a hurdle Cary Hartmann would have to clear if he ever hoped for a chance of parole. But at that point in 1990, Cary had a better idea how to win his freedom. That winter, a judge agreed to Cary's request for DNA analysis in the rape case. The judge told the director of Utah State Crime Lab to ship the evidence to an outside lab in California. Cary had convinced his own father to pay for the testing. That plan soon hit a snag. The crime lab director went to pull the evidence only to discover it had disappeared. Cary couldn't believe it. He suggested to a reporter from the Ogden Standard-Examiner he had been framed.
What possible reason can they have for losing the evidence?
The setback left Cary with just one last hope for deliverance. Blaine Nelson, the second Ogden City rapist.
I did what I did. I'm dealing with those problems.
We talked about Blaine in the last episode. Ogden police had arrested him in the spring of 1988, just months after Cary's conviction. In October of 91, Blaine told the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole his problems had started with a drug habit. He said he had burglarized homes to get money for drugs. That escalated to rape, he said, when he began encountering single women at some of the homes.
Drugs didn't make me do that, but they made the choice become a lot easier.
Blaine calmly said he had sexually assaulted 74 women prior to his arrest. A stunning, horrifying number.
Through what I was doing, I learned that a woman would do more for her children than she would for herself, and I used that to my advantage.
Blaine had developed strategies to find new victims, mostly by looking at the yards of the homes he burglarized.
If the yard looked messy, a lot of toys around, that gave me the indication that there was not a male present.
His final victim also spoke to the parole board.
I wish to see him rot in jail. He lied under oath at his hearing. I know this for a fact.
I'm not going to identify this woman by name, but I'm sharing what she said because she believed Blaine wasn't to be trusted. She didn't think drugs motivated the man who had taken such pleasure in terrorizing and humiliating her.
I had painkillers in my purse from a broken hip. He did not touch those.
Looking back on it, I still knew that I had a choice, even though I was on drugs.
So that's Blaine Nelson. The reason why Cary Hartmann thought Blaine was his ticket out of prison is Blaine said he had committed Cary's crimes.
I confessed to Ogden City Police of all my crimes, even crimes that other inmates in this institution is being held for at this time.
Blaine said he had first made the connection on the day of his sentencing.
When I was in Ogden City, I confessed to everything, and I also did some interviews with the TVs.
I'll remind you, one of the reporters who had interviewed Blaine that day was Cary Hartmann's friend, Larry Lewis. I don't know which reporter planted the seed, but Blaine told the parole board one of them suggested he might have committed Cary's crimes.
And I told him at that time that if that is the case, I will do everything I need to do to make that correction.
The plot had thickened a couple months later when Blaine went to court in Iron County for sentencing on additional crimes he had committed there. Blaine had bumped into Cary at the Iron County Correctional Facility.
He approached me and introduced himself and said there was a possibility that I was responsible for things that he had done.
Blaine said he had started writing letters to all the lawyers, letting them know he wanted to confess to Cary's crimes.
The response is from the authorities in Weber County that I am a liar, that I am crazy, I will admit to anything.
But Blaine insisted his motives were pure. Cary Hartmann had his own date with the parole board coming up. They couldn't let him out, not yet anyway, because Cary had to serve at least 15 years. But the hearing would be Cary's first chance to tell his side of the story to the people who might someday decide if he deserved a chance to rejoin society. He wanted to make an impression, so he reached out to someone he hoped might speak on his behalf, the President of the United States of America, George H.W. Bush.
There are times when the future seems thick as a fog, you sit and wait. But this is a time when the future seems a door you can walk right through, into a room called tomorrow.
Dear President Bush, I am incarcerated in the Utah State Prison System in Cedar City, Utah. I have proclaimed my innocence from day one.
Cary sent this letter to the president in December of '91. He explained the emerging science of DNA analysis would have exonerated him if not for the ineptitude of the crime lab.
Why would I go to all the trouble of having this testing done, just to have the results come back saying that he is guiltier? That just doesn't make sense.
Cary told the president it was no mistake the crime lab lost the evidence. He smelled conspiracy.
I'm not a fruitcake. I've had all kinds of tests to establish my sanity, and I am as sane and level-headed as you are, with an IQ of 135.
Cary said his rights had been abused from the start. Police had the wrong man. The real rapist, Cary said, was Blaine Nelson.
He has been directly linked to over 74 sexual assaults. The Ogden City Police cleared up 600 burglaries when they caught him.
Those numbers, 74 assaults and 600 burglaries, had only just come out at Blaine's parole board hearing 2 months earlier. The local newspapers had published them, and clearly, Cary was paying close attention. Cary concluded his letter with a plea for help, begging the president to personally contact the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole on his behalf.
Thank you for your most valuable time and attention. God bless you, always. Respectfully, Cary W. Hartmann.
And the president didn't come to Cary's aid. Maybe because he had his hands full with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the final end of the Cold War.
And we are not fixing to get into the middle of that.
It's no surprise, really, that Air Force One didn't make a stop in Utah on the day of Cary's first hearing before the parole board in January of '92.
I have sought DNA testing for 4 years.
This is Cary's own voice from a recording of that hearing.
I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this would prove my innocence.
Cary repeated almost word for word what he had said in his letter to the president.
I'm not a fruitcake. I'm not a crackpot. I'm level-headed. I'm sane.
Parole board member Heather Nelson Cook heard Cary out.
You make a very passionate and a very persuasive plea that you are innocent.
But she told Cary she had studied his case with great interest and was aware of more than just the facts of the crimes that had put him in prison. She'd reviewed the pre-sentence report we talked about in the last episode, which included many other eye-popping comments about Cary's sexual proclivities.
Some wife-sharing parties, some third-party orgies, a lot of pornography, incidents where you have exposed yourself.
What?
None of this should have been a shock to Cary, as he'd had opportunity to review the same materials. But it's worth considering his parents were in the room, and they hadn't been privy to the pre-sentence report.
Never have I used force in any way, shape, or form toward any female in any form of sexual act in 20 or 30 or 40 years. Never. It's not in my makeup. It's not me.
Heather, the parole board member, countered that Cary's MO was using psychological coercion, like threatening to kill the children of the women he had assaulted. Cary denied that, too. He said that's how Blaine Nelson operated.
He was the man that was caught, convicted, and confessed to at least 2 of the crimes that I was charged with.
And a follow-up investigation was done, apparently, and that the conclusions of that was that he hadn't.
Cary had collected sworn affidavits from 3 people who had each said they had overheard Blaine taking credit for Cary's crimes at different times and in different places. Now, Cary spread those statements on the table, displaying them for the parole board.
1, 2, 3 affidavits. Blaine Nelson stated that he committed the crimes I'm in here for. There they are.
The affidavits didn't have the impact Cary might have hoped. Blaine Nelson's admissions weren't a get-out-of-jail-free card.
He's not the only one in the prison that's taking responsibility for other people's crimes. You're aware of that. I mean, it happens.
Heather, the parole board member, told Cary it didn't really matter anyhow. The parole board didn't have the power to retry his case. She couldn't let him out even if she believed him, which, it seems, she didn't.
And as I look at 20 years of unusual, aggressive, deviant sexual activity, I do see you as a risk.
She told Cary he wasn't going anywhere for at least another 10 years. At the start of this episode, we heard about a jailhouse snitch I'm calling Charlie. He had told the FBI Cary Hartmann killed Sheree Warren and was infatuated with serial killer Ted Bundy. But I didn't tell you about another intriguing claim Charlie made. Charlie said Cary had offered the second Ogden serial rapist, Blaine Nelson, $50,000 to take the blame for Cary's crimes.
Because I've had so much time anyway, I have nothing to lose.
That again is the voice of Blaine Nelson, the second Ogden City rapist from his 1991 parole board hearing. Blaine said police had believed the claim he had colluded with Cary.
Detective Zimmerman from Ogden City come to the Okers and see me.
The Okers were a medium-security housing unit at the Utah State Prison.
And that's when he said that I was nuts and would admit to anything and was being paid off.
But Blaine said it wasn't true.
I signed a waiver in Iron County not to be moved in the same living quarters with Hartmann for the possibility that if this did go to court that they would say we traded stories or made things. So I avoided that. And that's the last I've heard on the Hartmann case.
Blaine hadn't heard anything more about Cary Hartmann because neither police, the courts, nor the parole board had believed him. Cary's MO had been a little different than Blaine's, and other evidence linked Cary to his victims. I should note, Blaine had also tried to take credit for a crime attributed to a third serial rapist, a guy named Jerry Casita.
Also contacted one of his lawyers. Nothing was done.
Like Cary, Jerry Casita had latched onto Blaine's admission, using it as grounds for an appeal of his sentence. A judge held a hearing to try to get to the bottom of this mess. Blaine testified. He gave a first-hand account of the rape attributed to Jerry Casita, but Blaine's version contradicted the victim's own account. The judge determined Blaine wasn't credible. That was 30 years ago. Blaine is still in prison. I decided to write him to ask if he still stood by his claim he had committed the crimes attributed to Cary Hartmann. Blaine wrote back, saying yes, he did stand by it. I wrote Blaine again, asking if the story told by Charlie, the FBI informant, was true. Had Cary offered Blaine $50,000 to take the fall, as Charlie had claimed? Blaine said Cary, quote, never offered me at any time any money. I am very ashamed at my past, Blaine wrote, and have tried to do the right thing. Truth is truth. That may be, but after all these decades, it seems someone, either Blaine Nelson or Charlie the informant, lied. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. So I was driving down the road the other day when I saw a little cat on the sidewalk. She appeared to be in distress, but couldn't exactly ask for help. So I got out, I checked her over, took her to the vet. And it turns out, yeah, she really did need help. But I was there. I had her back. None of us can get through life entirely on our own. It's important we have people in our corners, like, say, therapists, who can listen and provide helpful advice when we are in distress. If you're thinking about trying therapy, consider using BetterHelp. It's entirely online and works around your schedule, making it convenient and flexible. Discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/cold today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/cold. Your body is your business. I'm not going to tell you how you should feel about your shape, size, style, or anything else. We all have different relationships with our bodies, individual goals for our own fitness. I try to stay in shape so I can hike, kayak, and explore nature without feeling limited, but I do have some bad habits that can get in the way. And I probably need some help eating better. If your goals for your body involve breaking a cycle of bad habits, consider trying Noom to get you there. Noom Weight uses psychology to help you understand the reasons behind your cravings. It's also flexible, with daily lessons and even personal coaching available if you choose to use it. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom Weight's psychology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com/cold. That's NOOM.com/cold to sign up for your trial today. And check out Noom's first ever book, The Noom Mindset, a deep dive into the psychology of behavior change. Available to buy now wherever books are sold. We've spent a lot of time over the last couple episodes talking about the Ogden City rapist case and Cary Hartmann's role at the center of it.
Any type of physical aggression toward anyone, even especially a female, is so abhorrent, it's so terrible.
It's drawn us away a bit from our focus, the disappearance of Sheree Warren. It's necessary, though, because understanding how Cary Hartmann treated other women at the time he was dating Sheree provides a lens that puts a sharper focus on his relationship with Sheree. Cary objectified women, both strangers and romantic partners alike. We don't know what all Sheree endured during her time with Cary, but it's now fair to ask how Sheree might have reacted if she had uncovered any of his dark secrets. Sheree's friend Pam Volk, who had worked with her at the credit union, told me she had married and moved away soon after Sheree disappeared.
And I felt bad because we had moved to Germany, so there wasn't really anything I could do anyway, but being so far away, it kind of felt, I don't know, it just made me feel a little bit guilty, I guess.
Pam and her husband returned stateside a few years later. They were surprised to find no one seemed to talk about Sheree anymore.
It didn't get a lot of attention, no. Not like missing cases do now.
Sheree's disappearance had left her estranged husband, Chuck Warren, in legal limbo because their divorce remained unresolved. Chuck convinced a judge to finalize the divorce in May of '91. The judge granted Chuck full custody of his and Sheree's son. Sheree's family held a memorial for her a year and a half later, in October of '92. I'd love to play you a news clip from that event, but KSL, the station I work for, didn't go to the memorial.
It's frustrating. And I feel so bad for her parents.
I can't tell you why KSL didn't cover the story. It's possible the station's staff were all on more pressing assignments that day. I've worked as a newscast producer. Sometimes it's a judgment call about what gets covered with limited staff and resources. Reporter Larry Lewis, who covered stories in and around Ogden for KSL, was on shift that day. But he aired a story about a California dad who had skipped out on paying child support.
Then this week, someone tipped the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office that he was in Utah and getting ready to fly out of state.
Larry, I don't need to remind you, was a personal friend of Cary Hartmann's. Other news media did attend the service. There's a clip from TV station ABC4 that shows Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, walking to Sheree's new headstone with Sheree's son, Adam.
I tell him that God's watching over him. Our Heavenly Father's watching over his mother.
Adam was just 10 years old in the clip, dressed in a little gray suit. He told me recently he had hated being paraded in front of the TV cameras, and that's part of why you're not hearing from him in this podcast. Mary Sorensen told the Salt Lake Tribune that day she intended to have her daughter declared legally deceased. Cary's oldest friend, Steve Bartlett, saw that story in the paper. You might recall Bartlett from the last episode. He was the special investigator for the Salt Lake County District Attorney who had exchanged letters with Cary after his conviction, urging him to reveal the location of Sheree Warren's remains. Cary had told his old friend he didn't know anything about it. The plight of Sheree's parents moved Bartlett. He decided to make one final effort to reach Cary. He wrote another letter to his childhood pal.
Please, 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 if you know where Sheree is, and I really think that you do, please somehow let somebody know so that the family can end their grief.
Cary's response dripped with indignant disdain.
I feel sorry for you, Steve. Friends are very special and should not be taken so lightly. Let me tell you about Sheree. She was the most important lady in my life at that time, or any other time for that matter. I tried to find her with every bit of strength that I had at that time. I did everything that was in my power, and if that is not good enough for you and the rest of the people out there that still think I had something to do with her disappearance, then that is too bad.
A year later, in October of 1993, Sheree's brother went to court and asked a judge to declare his sister legally deceased. The judge approved the request. In the eyes of the law, Sheree Warren was dead. That unlocked a life insurance policy Sheree had had. You might expect I'm going to say her ex-husband, Chuck Warren, staked a claim on that money. But that's not what happened. Chuck arranged to have the money go to his and Sheree's son, Adam, and no one else. That move hadn't absolved Chuck Warren of suspicion. He remained a suspect at that point in '93. So did Cary Hartmann, and there were even some who still thought a serial killer might have plucked Sheree off the streets of Salt Lake City. It was an idea Cary's own private investigator had promoted, but former Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner didn't see much evidence to back up that theory.
Just that she was seen in that parking lot of the credit union when she left that day.
As you might remember, the Salt Lake City Police Department had lumped Sheree in on a list of other missing and murdered women. Salt Lake detectives had linked the deaths of 3 other young women to the same gun. They suspected a serial killer was on the loose, and they had formed a task force in 1986 in the hopes of catching him.
I knew they were busy, they were doing a lot, and they grouped this case in with it.
But Shane told me the Salt Lake detectives hadn't invested much attention on Sheree Warren's disappearance specifically.
Because you'd get hit with, listen, this is a missing person out of Roy, and
Shane said a lot of cops across the country were all in on the idea of using technology to hunt serial killers during the 80s.
And that's when all these serial murders like Ted Bundy and a lot of others was being kind of found out, and they had tracked their whereabouts and all the different locations they had been.
The FBI had launched VICAP in the summer of '85, just a few months before Sheree Warren disappeared. VICAP is a database and analysis team dedicated to catching serial criminals by spotting trends in their behaviors.
And so now that's kind of coming into play.
The FBI published a VICAP alert in the February 1988 edition of the Bureau's monthly magazine. It included 9 case summaries about missing and murdered women in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. One of them described the disappearance of Sheree Warren. Only 2 months later, the Salt Lake Task Force publicly announced a suspect, Idaho spree killer Paul Ezra Rhodes.
Rhodes is on death row in Idaho for the murders of 2 convenience store clerks and a schoolteacher last year. All 3 female victims were shot with the same .38 caliber handgun.
The 3 Salt Lake victims had likewise all been shot with a .38.
In an interview with Salt Lake police at the Idaho State Prison, Rhodes denied he had anything to do with the Utah killings, but investigators say he revealed some interesting facts.
The connections were circumstantial at best.
When Mr. Rhodes was arrested, those 38 .357 handgun murders of female clerks in convenience stores that are similar to our type murders came to a drastic stop.
That's correlation, not causation. A very weak form of circumstantial evidence. Rhodes was never charged in connection with the Utah murders, and Idaho executed him in 2011. In any case, the Salt Lake Task Force had it wrong. Rhodes wasn't their killer. The Salt Lake detectives had started with a conclusion, then worked backwards trying to find evidence that could support it. When that didn't work, the task force floundered. It disbanded in 1991, leaving the 3 cases it had tied to the same gun unsolved. No evidence has emerged in all the years since to suggest Sheree Warren's disappearance is in any way linked to those other Salt Lake Task Force cases, as Cary Hartmann's private investigator had suggested. Former Ogden police detective Shane Miner had once briefed the Salt Lake detectives about Cary Hartmann, when it had seemed Cary might have been a suspect for the Salt Lake Task Force. But by the early 90s, that speculation had died out, and Shane had moved on to other assignments.
My focus had kind of drifted away from Hartmann.
Cary had at last accepted his life in custody. He spent a lot of time writing letters to his old friends in Ogden, like the taxidermist Brent Morgan.
Everything that he talked about in there was poor me or this, that, and the other. But I sent him a letter back, and I basically said, until you come to realize or rationalize what you've done, I don't want to have any more correspondence with you.
Cary also stayed in touch with Dave Moore, who owned the sewing machine repair shop.
He made a collect phone call to the store every Christmas Eve for about 3 years.
And Cary made calls to his TV reporter friend, Larry Lewis.
Yeah, and I poured cold water on his communications with me. It just wasn't right. I didn't feel comfortable knowing that he'd been convicted of that. And I pretty much ended, a relationship.
Larry's case of cold feet about Cary Hartmann didn't come on right away. I have prison records that show Cary continued making calls to Larry for years.
He wanted to continue reaching out. I didn't feel comfortable, continuing the association. I think I sent him some handballs.
Okay.
To wherever he was, and that was the end of it.
Cary still hoped to get out of prison, but the only pathway remaining ran through the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. The board alone held the power to keep Cary in for life or to let him out once he had served his minimum of 15 years. The deciding factor would be Cary's own behavior in the meantime. The board did not reward defiance. Cary would have to complete sex offender therapy before the board would ever consider letting him out. He had been booted from treatment once before for refusing to play along, but now realized he'd have to try again. Here, though, Cary ran into a problem. He couldn't get back into therapy unless he admitted to his crime. This is something Cary had insisted he would never do when he had gone before the parole board the first time in 1992.
I can't tell the judge that I didn't do it, tell my family and look them in the eye that I didn't do it. My sons repeatedly that I didn't do it, even though I don't see them, and all of a sudden turn right around and say, oh, yep, I did it, I was just kidding before.
Cary had no choice but to eat crow. Prison records show he requested permission to call all of his immediate family, as well as several friends and attorneys, in May of 1995. I wasn't on those calls, obviously, but based on the timeline, I can surmise Cary told his friends and family he was going to admit to the rape that had sent him to prison. But only that one. He then reapplied to sex offender therapy, admitting his guilt, and was accepted back into the program. But Cary's second round in treatment proved short-lived. He got booted again less than 2 years later, after jail staff found pornography in his cell. A clerk at Utah's 2nd District Court in Ogden received a letter at the start of January 1998. It had come from a snitch, a prison inmate named David Westmoreland. He said Cary Hartmann had told him about the murders of 2 women. If the stories were true, Westmoreland wrote, he knew where to find the bodies. The letter found its way to Jack Bell, who by that point had made captain at the Roy City Police Department. Jack told me he had handed off the Sheree Warren case after first promoting to sergeant a decade earlier.
I took most of this evidence to OPD.
The tip reignited Jack's dormant desire to find Sheree. He went to talk to Westmoreland himself. Let me give you some background on David Westmoreland. He murdered his own cousin in 1981. Westmoreland had first met Cary Hartmann a few years later, in '88, when they were housed in cells next door to one another. They'd bumped into each other again at the Iron County Correctional Facility around 1995.
Yes, and he said Cary told him the story of killing her.
Jack's notes say Westmoreland claimed Cary killed 2 women. One of them was Cary's girlfriend. They'd been arguing over sex, Westmoreland said, so Cary had hit her with his flashlight. He had then allegedly driven her up a canyon, sexually assaulted her, and killed her by smacking her in the head with the jack from his truck.
I think he said it was an accident and that taking her up to this rest area.
Westmoreland said Cary buried the body at a rest area along eastbound Interstate 80, midway between Ogden and Evanston, Wyoming, in a place called Echo Canyon.
It was possible because of the location and accessibility.
Westmoreland described the burial site as up a concrete footpath from the rest area's vending machine, near a patch of trees, surrounded by blue flowers.
We went up there.
Jack brought dogs with him.
We didn't find nothing, but we didn't do a lot of digging either.
Because they had no clue where to even start. They didn't see disturbed ground, and the dogs gave no indication. Still, the exercise brought back memories for Jack of the psychic letter he had received after Sheree Warren disappeared. A letter Jack believed had really originated with Cary. It had described a truck stop in the mountains and a burial spot near Red Rock Cliffs.
But if you're standing there out of your car at that rest area and you look straight across the highways at the Red Rock across there, it's exactly what was drawn on this letter.
On the psychic letter from '85.
Exactly. So, boom.
The walls of Echo Canyon are made up of orange stone. So as Jack Bell stood at the rest area in the canyon and looked across the interstate at those orange cliffs, the details from the psychic letter bubbled up in his brain. They seemed to line up with what David Westmoreland had told him.
That's what I got out of what Cary supposedly told Westmoreland. Where she was at was up there.
The psychic letter had mentioned 2 guys stopping for snacks at a truck stop.
The truck stop, to me, was at Echo Junction, the old Echo Cafe.
Echo Junction is a small town at the foot of the canyon. It's all but abandoned today, but was once a bustling place where people headed to the mountains might stop for a drink. But Jack Bell's search at the Echo Canyon rest area was a bust. No body. No Sheree. But the prospect of at last locating the remains of Sheree Warren proved a powerful siren song for police. Jack Bell figured the time had come to give the cold case a fresh look. So he organized a reunion. Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner received an invitation.
I got a call from Chris Zimmerman, who was the Roy Police Chief at the time, and went out and met with him and Captain Bell about the Sheree Warren case and how things had kind of dropped off after the rape investigations and stuff like that.
Shane was at that time working with the FBI on a violent fugitive apprehension team. He'd developed relationships with agents and officers across Utah. It made him the obvious choice to take over the search for Sheree.
Seems like everybody's resources were somewhat limited, so I think that was another way of potentially bringing in some resources to try to look at this.
Jack and Shane both knew the stakes.
At one time, Bill Daines from the county attorney's office told Shane and I and somebody else, if we could find the body, he would give us a complaint.
In other words, a murder charge against Cary Hartmann, if they could find Sheree's remains. Jack gave Shane his notes and walked him through the case.
He relayed that information to me as far as the people he had talked to, pulled what reports they had.
Jack had given his formal reports and evidence to Ogden police back in 1987. Ogden had taken over the case because the two women who had lived above Cary Hartmann had reported seeing and hearing Sheree at their house in Ogden the night she disappeared. Shane remembered Ogden police had opened their own case file at that time.
So I went back and tried to find those reports, and that became problematic because I couldn't find the reports. They had changed the reporting systems.
The missing paperwork included reports about interviews with several members of Cary Hartmann's so-called supper club. Detective John Stubbs, for example, had been in the room when Jack had questioned KSL-TV reporter Larry Lewis. Stubbs had written a report and filed it under Ogden's Sheree Warren case number. So where was that report?
I never could find that case report or the interviews that was done off of that.
Shane told me he thinks the missing records were just lost in the shuffle, misplaced as the Ogden Police Department moved to a new headquarters building in the early 90s. Or the papers might have been taken home by one of the investigators and never returned.
Plus, there was a lot of technology change during that period of time, too, from handwritten notes to computer-generated information.
I submitted my own public records request to the Ogden Police Department for anything filed under their Sheree Warren case number. The department searched its records archive and told me they couldn't find anything. Nothing on an unsolved, cold case homicide. There's another possible explanation for what might have happened to the missing records. Cary Hartmann did have friends in the Ogden Police Department.
The fact that he had been a reserve in there, that's where he made contact with these guys.
And some stood to be embarrassed if their association with Cary became public knowledge.
Yes, exactly. They wanted to stay right away from Cary Hartmann investigation.
So I do wonder if someone, sometime, might have intentionally made those reports disappear. However it happened, the records are gone. The missing police reports meant Shane Miner didn't have significant pieces of the puzzle in his head when he set out to investigate the story of the snitch, David Westmoreland.
When you're talking to inmates, you never know what their true motive is. So it's kind of difficult to really take it as being factual information.
Shane pulled prison records. They verified Westmoreland had lived next to Cary Hartmann at the Iron County Correctional Facility.
He knew Hartmann, and he did have some conversation with him because there were some facts that he knew about. But then I also learned, with my experience, these guys are really clever at making things up and can build a story around whatever's told to them.
Shane decided to re-interview Westmoreland himself.
But a lot of his facts didn't really match up with what we had.
Westmoreland once again described the rest area in Echo Canyon, the vending machine, and the concrete path.
And I was unfamiliar with what he was talking about, so I drove up there after we interviewed him. I found the rest stop that I think he was talking about.
Shane walked up the steep path to the overview, where a few months earlier, Jack Bell had stood looking across the interstate at the Orange Cliffs.
It was a truck stop area, trucks parked up in there.
Not a very safe or secluded place to dump a body. Shane's doubt began to grow.
You would have to drag a body up a cement pathway, and just uncharacteristic for a dump site if you're going to be dumping a body.
Shane arranged to have a dog team come and rerun the search at the rest area, but the result didn't change. no sign of Sheree. The snitch, David Westmoreland, had drawn maps of the spot for Shane. I have copies of them and went to the rest area myself. I walked up that path, then stepped off into the dry grass.
Let's see if I can step over this fence without getting any barbed wire. There we go.
I found what appeared to be the spot Westmoreland had described, tucked behind scrub oak and thistle. It did not seem like a place someone could bury a body and have the grave go unnoticed for more than 30 years. Earlier I told you about some FBI files and a jailhouse informant I called Charlie, who had fed a special agent information about Cary Hartmann in 1989. Detective Shane Miner came across those same FBI reports as he worked the Sheree Warren investigation a decade later.
But I didn't know who that person was, and that took quite a bit of time to find out who he was, too.
We're going to take a slight detour for the next few minutes as I reveal the true identity of Charlie, the FBI informant, the snitch who said Cary Hartmann watched that TV show BL Stryker, the informant who said Cary Hartmann was obsessed with Ted Bundy, the guy who said Cary killed Sheree Warren. His real name is William Babel.
At the Utah State Prison with one William Babel, is that right? Babel?
This audio comes from a 1991 police interview recording. William Babel, a.k.a. Charlie the Informant, told a detective he had been in Cary Hartmann's sex offender therapy group at Iron County in 1988. He'd heard Cary reading his autobiography in the group sessions.
And I know Cary Hartmann's story very well.
And that's probably where William Babel gathered the information he had fed to the FBI.
And I was there when Mr. Hartmann explained that he had been with a psychic and he knew where Sheree Warren was buried, what she was wearing when she disappeared, how she died, you know, the whole spiel about this girl's disappearance. You know, her car was found in Vegas, somebody drove down and took it down there and flew home. And how could Cary Hartmann know all that shit unless Cary Hartmann did it?
William Babel had told the FBI Cary Hartmann admitted to killing Sheree Warren. 3 years later, he told a detective he'd only thought that was the case at the time.
Because Hartmann was living with her when she disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true.
But I don't think Hartmann did it.
Babel said he now instead believed the person who killed Sheree Warren was a guy named Doug Lovell. That name should sound familiar if you've listened to Season 2 of this podcast. Doug Lovell abducted and raped Joyce Yost, then returned months later and killed Joyce to prevent her from testifying in court about what he had done.
What about Sheree Warren?
I think he knows about it. And he says, well, they'll never stick me with that because Cary Hartmann's the one that's going to end up eating that one.
I know this can get confusing, but what we're dealing with here is a snitch who at first said Cary Hartmann had killed Sheree Warren, then later changed his story to say Doug Lovell killed Sheree. He had no evidence to back up either claim, which means we should treat everything William Babel said with extreme skepticism.
Did Lovell ever give you a reason to tie him and Hartmann together?
No.
I've talked to a lot of people about both the Sheree Warren and Joyce Yost cases. I've examined both case files. There are some parallels and crossover points, but I've yet to find any hard evidence that would link Sheree Warren to Doug Lovell.
I don't know that she'd ever met Doug.
Sheree's friend and former coworker Pam Volk told me she finds the Lovell killed Sheree theory hard to swallow.
It just breaks my heart that nothing has been able to be found out. I mean, I understand if there's not evidence, there's not evidence, you know. And with no body, it's kind of hard.
Hey, Prime members, did you know you could be listening to this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music? Binge all 3 seasons of Cold and other top true crime shows like Suspect, Morbid, and hundreds of others ad-free with your Prime membership. To listen, visit amazon.com/cold-s3. With Amazon Music, you get access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts. Listen to your favorite shows without the ads, offline, on the go, or wherever life takes you with Amazon Music. Start listening by visiting amazon.com/cold-s3. That's amazon.com/cold-s3. I first met former Ogden Police Detective Shane Miner at a restaurant in downtown Ogden called the Union Grill. He'd agreed to talk to me about the Sheree Warren case over lunch, but he made no promises about ever going on the record. We took a seat. Shane picked a spot where he could put his back against the wall and keep an eye on the door. Not a surprise for a guy who spent decades investigating violent crimes in the city. Shane keeps a low profile, which sounds funny in my head considering he's both tall and broad-shouldered. He told me he'd always avoided reporters during his police career, but we spent more than 3 hours that day discussing the Sheree Warren case. I later asked Shane if he would agree to an interview.
I don't like talking in front of a mic, and all the years that I worked, I think I rarely talked in front of a mic, so...
Or to a reporter even at all.
If at all, yeah.
Shane's not a glory seeker, but he has a deep sense of duty. That had come into play when he had first taken up the Sheree Warren case, more than a decade after Sheree disappeared.
Would you have called that investigation a cold case at that point in '98?
Yes.
Shane's not what I'd call exuberant, at least not when the recorder's rolling. But I can tell you, he feels a deep sense of responsibility to Sheree, a woman he never even met.
You almost have the feeling like, well, if there's something you can contribute to it one way or the other, then you have to do that.
And this is the only reason why, in the end, Shane agreed to let me interview him.
It is helpful, even if maybe a bit painful for you.
Yeah, probably.
When Shane took over the Sheree Warren case in 1998, he found the file was in shambles. Pieces were spread across multiple departments or missing altogether. Only a handful of potential witnesses had provided detailed statements over the years. Shane knew no prosecutor would ever file charges based on a case that disorganized. So Shane headed into 1999 with a new objective: reinvestigate the Sheree Warren case from scratch, narrowing it down to a single suspect. But who was that? Shane still had two plausible primary suspects: Sheree's former husband, Chuck Warren, and her now incarcerated boyfriend, Cary Hartmann. He needed a better understanding of both those relationships.
There was none of that information really in the report other than she was in the process of a divorce and was living with her mom and dad in Roy.
He set about filling in the gaps.
Just trying to track down people that might have known her and get their spin on what was going on in that period of time when she was last seen and missing.
Shane began with Sheree's parents. Ed and Mary Sorensen told Shane the story of the last time they had seen their daughter. Mary described what Sheree had been wearing that October morning: black pants, a red blouse, and a gray suede jacket.
Mrs. Sorensen thought that was what she would wear and mentioned that she was still missing a gray purse.
But hold on a second, because Jack Bell's notes about his first conversation with Mary Sorensen the day after Sheree disappeared didn't mention a jacket. Here, almost 15 years later, Mary described Sheree wearing the same type of jacket Shane had himself found in Cary Hartmann's apartment when serving the search warrants in the Ogden City rapist investigation. This was problematic because it suggested Mary might have added that detail to her story after learning about the jacket from police. A possible feedback loop. More on that in a bit. Shane asked Sheree's parents what they remembered about Cary Hartmann.
And they kind of laid out a lot different picture of the relationship between Hartmann and Sheree.
They said Sheree's relationship with Cary hadn't been serious. They'd only been going out a few months. That contradicted what Cary had told several other people.
Hartmann's story is they'd been going out for a long period of time and were so madly in love with each other, yet nobody else says that.
Sheree's parents' account also didn't jibe with how Cary had described his and Sheree's relationship in his statement to the private investigator Michael Neumeier.
He had offered to help Hartmann look for Sheree.
You heard that statement in episode 3.
Mike, I've put together everything that I can think of up to date.
It's a typewritten notebook, and apparently it's from a recording.
I was told by ladies that work at the credit union with Sheree, they said that Chuck was very volatile. He was there, pleasant to talk to, but yet he would explode upon getting irritated, mad.
You read through there, and it's just like Hartmann's telling a story.
That little lady meant everything and the entire world to me. Drinking all night with the boys just wasn't what it was cracked up to be, and when I said 2 drinks and I was coming home, that's what I meant. She said, "That's wonderful." She said, "I'll be waiting for you at home."
Shane tracked down Michael Neumeier and talked to him, too. Neumeier verified he had made the transcription of Cary's statement and even signed a copy to attest to its accuracy.
I had a conversation with him about getting the original recording, and he said he would try to get one for me, but he never did, and I'd never seen that or heard the original recording.
Neumeier said he had worked on Cary's behalf right up until Cary's arrest in the rape case. At that moment, Neumeier came to believe Cary had lied to him. Shane tracked down Sheree's former coworkers. Her old boss told Shane she remembered hosting a party at her house back in the fall of '85, just a few weeks before Sheree disappeared. Sheree had come and brought Cary with her. At some point during the evening, Sheree had slipped away from Cary and confided to her boss she was thinking of breaking up with him. Shane went to talk to Sheree's friend, Pam Volk.
It was a little intimidating, but he just asked me a series of questions, I think, about Chuck and about Cary and about Sheree.
Pam told Shane she remembered Sheree calling Cary kinky, saying that bothered her and that their relationship wasn't serious.
But to listen to Hartmann, she's with him all the time. She's got a lot of other things going on in her life besides him.
Like her new promotion at the credit union. Shane called Richard Moss, the credit union manager Sheree had been training the day she disappeared.
I think he made some handwritten notes that he sent to me.
Richard, as it turned out, had written down his recollections of the last time he had seen Sheree. He had kept those notes for years.
So you look at the credibility of that versus somebody that goes years later, and then they're trying to remember. Some people have really good memory recall, and other people don't have such good. So I believe it was very credible on his part.
I, too, have a copy of Richard's notes. I pulled them out after interviewing him.
Could I impose upon you to kind of read this aloud for me? I'll record it.
Yeah.
I wanted to see if what Richard told me matched what he had written all those years ago.
She wore no rings on fingers, wore black slacks with black high heels. She had on a red and white striped blouse, buttoned down front over the shoulder sleeve.
Richard's notes don't mention any outerwear. As we've previously discussed, this case might all hinge on a tale of 2 coats, Sheree's gray suede jacket or Cary's black parka. Knowing which Sheree was wearing when she left for work on the morning of her disappearance could help prove whether Cary told the truth about not seeing Sheree that night, because the gray jacket later turned up in Cary's apartment. Unfortunately, Richard can't resolve that question for us.
She told me her ex-husband came into the Ogden office at one time and threatened to kill her.
As far as I know, Richard had no reason to exaggerate this account of what Sheree had told him about her argument with Chuck Warren over alimony. Chuck, remember, had refused to cooperate with Detective Jack Bell from the very early days of the investigation. Shane had a different experience.
He seemed quite open to me.
Shane asked Chuck about that blow-up at the credit union branch.
He told me about it. Said it was stupid on his part, but it wasn't any type of physical fight. He was just upset.
Shane's notes say Chuck hadn't intended to scare Sheree, but he had said something along the lines of, "There are all sorts of ways to get even."
It just didn't seem like he was holding anything back or hiding anything.
Chuck told Shane he had only realized later in life what he had lost by not working to salvage his marriage to Sheree.
One of the things he said about Sheree was probably the best thing ever happened to him, and he was really stupid for doing what he did.
Chuck wasn't able to remember what had prevented him from taking his Supra down to the dealership in Salt Lake on the afternoon of Sheree's disappearance. But Shane told me everything else Chuck said was consistent with what he had learned from other sources.
Again, this conversation was in 1999, and it's pretty similar, I think, to the conversations he had with Bell back in '85 and what the Sorensens had told me. There wasn't nothing that he said that would set me off that I would say, oh yeah, you're a suspect in this.
Which left Shane focused on just one person, Cary Hartmann. He decided to go talk to Kaylin and Mary, the two women who had lived above Cary at the time Sheree disappeared. They once again described how their former neighbor, the Nighthawk, had kept odd hours and two-timed all his girlfriends.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what they talked about was just consistent with what we knew about Hartmann's habits.
They repeated the story of the loud argument they had heard between Cary and Sheree at the house. Shane needed to pin down exactly when that had happened.
Their statement referred to a couple of days before her disappearance came out in the paper.
He headed to the county library to look through old periodicals.
The first one I could find was a little clip on October 4th, and then there was a follow-up one the next day or two after that. So a couple of days before that, was right around October 2nd.
October 2nd, the night Sheree Warren disappeared. But right around wasn't close enough if Shane intended to convince a prosecutor, let alone a jury, Sheree had made it to Cary Hartmann's apartment on the night she disappeared. The best, and perhaps only evidence that might place Sheree Warren with Cary Hartmann on the night of her disappearance was a jacket.
There was a gray suede jacket.
The jacket Shane had found in Cary's apartment while serving a search warrant there in May of 1987. Sheree Warren's mom, Mary Sorensen, hadn't mentioned a gray jacket when she had first reported her daughter missing in 1985. Roy Police Detective Jack Bell wrote in his notes police showed Mary Sorensen a picture of the jacket after they found it in 87. Jack wrote Mary, said the gray jacket, quote, belongs to Sheree and is the jacket she had on the last time she had seen Sheree.
And that jacket was put into the OPD evidence.
A decade passed. Then in September of 1999, Detective Shane Miner invited Sheree's parents and her sister Marcy to come to Ogden Police Headquarters.
And I had that jacket pulled out of evidence, and they looked at the jacket, and Mrs. Sorensen identified that jacket as something that she would wear the day that she went missing. It went with what she was wearing, and identified that as Sheree's jacket.
Notice how Shane says something she would wear. There's a little ambiguity there, but I think that's coming more from Shane Miner than Mary Sorensen. Shane's doubt makes sense when you consider the passage of time. It had been 12 years since police had showed Mary a photo of the gray jacket. Ogden police should have written a report about the gray suede jacket when they had first seized it out of Cary Hartmann's apartment. They should have invited Mary to come look at it in person back then. But I haven't been able to find any report like that. Any insight as to why that identification didn't happen in 87?
I don't know. I can't tell you. If I could have found the reports that were generated in 87, there might be an answer in that. But what I could find, I don't know.
Another clue lost in the missing Ogden police records. Shane had one more idea. Maybe the jacket harbored an invisible secret. A drop of blood or a strand of hair. Something that might prove the jacket belonged to Sheree and that she had met with violence while wearing it. Where Cary Hartmann had insisted DNA evidence would exonerate him, Shane Miner hoped it might do the opposite. If he could find Sheree's DNA on that jacket, it would prove it was hers. If he could find Cary's blood on the jacket, it might be enough to convince prosecutors to file a murder charge against him. Ogden police submitted the jacket to Utah's State Crime Lab. A criminalist applied a chemical reagent to the fabric, then stood back and watched for any sign of a reaction. Nothing happened. There was no blood on the jacket. We started this episode talking about that old TV show, B.L. Stryker. In the first episode, Stryker is drawn into a case involving a serial rapist who escalates to murder.
So there's no prints, right? No fibers from the jacket? You ain't got nothing.
But I didn't tell you how it ended. It concludes with Stryker confronting the serial rapist/murderer. Spoiler alert. The bad guy turns out to be a disgruntled journalist. He reveals he's killed Stryker's love interest, which results in Stryker and the journalist duking it out man to man. In the midst of the melee, Stryker pulls a gun and shoots the killer to death. It's all neat and tidy. We know who the killer is. We understand his ham-fisted motivation. We've seen justice served. A wistful sax begins to wail as we see Stryker on the beach sometime later, jogging off into the sunset. Roll credits. TV and movies have conditioned us to expect these kinds of endings, but real life rarely delivers them. Investigations, especially no-body cold case homicides, are exercises in frustration and disappointment. We've now reached a low point in the story of the search for Sheree Warren. You might feel there's no chance of ever getting to the truth, but I've not given up, and I hope you won't either. Sheree needs us to persevere, and at least a degree of accountability is coming on the next episode of Cold.
This would have been the road that I think he had access to. So, there's unlimited places where he could have dumped her along here.
Hard to think like a bandit, would you have picked a characteristic turn or a rock or tree or something as a landmark?
If you have information about the disappearance of Sheree Warren, now is the time to share it. You can reach me by emailing cold@ksl.com or contact the Roy City Police Department at 801-774-1063. I also want you to know, if you've experienced abuse or sexual violence, you're not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Hey, Prime members, you can binge every episode of Cold ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. Or you can listen ad-free with Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at Wondery.com/survey. Cold is researched, written, and hosted by me, Dave Cawley. Audio production and sound design by Ben Kiebrick and Aaron Mason. Mixing and mastering by Ben Kiebrick. Michael Bonmiller composed our main theme, with additional music this season by Allison Layton Brown. Additional voices in this episode provided by
John Green
and
Aaron Mason.
My personal thanks to our editorial team: Amy Donaldson, Andrea Smarden, Ryan Meeks, Becky Bruce, Kira Faramond, Kellyanne Halverson, Josh Tilton, and Felix Bonnell. For Amazon Music and Wondery, managing producer Candice Manriquez-Wren, producer Claire Chambers, senior producer Lizzie Bassett, and executive producer Morgan Jones. Special thanks to Cale Bittner and Allison Vermeulen. With Workhouse Media executive producers Paul Anderson and Nick Piniella. And for KSL Podcasts, executive producer Cheryl Worsley. For pictures and more, go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and follow us on social at The Cold Podcast. Most of all, thank you for listening.
What are you saving up for? A vacation? A remodel? Or just because saving is a smart thing to do? A CD from Sandy Spring Bank gives you time to grow your savings at a guaranteed rate. Right now, you can earn interest at 4.25% annual percentage yield on a 14-month CD or 4.00% APY on a 35-month CD. Ready to grow your savings? Let's talk. Visit sandyspringbank.com/CD specials. Minimum opening deposit is $2,500, member FDIC.